We don't need to be told to play. It comes naturally, instinctively, joyfully. As Taylor Swift put it, play is going to play, play, play. But why do we do this? Where does this urge come from? The question becomes even more mysterious when we consider the fact that many distinct species play, even ones which are separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Our guest this week is Gordon Burghardt, a professor at the University of Tennessee. He's an ethologist, so he's interested in animal behaviour. He's also a herpetologist, so he's particularly interested in reptiles. Gordon has made many contributions. He introduced the concept of critical anthropomorphism, which is where we neither blindly accept that animal behaviour that seems somewhat human-like really does represent analogous emotions or instincts to those that we have, but nor does critical anthropomorphism demand that we deny animals the possibility of having some human-like characteristics. And indeed, it asks us to use our own understanding of ourselves and to see where that might justifiably apply to animals. But Gordon is perhaps most known for his contribution to animal play. His 2006 book on the genesis of animal play laid out 5 criteria for understanding where play was happening in animals, and this really helped put the field on a solid footing. The more I reflect on this conversation, and on play in general, the more convinced I am that play needs to be more than just a footnote in animal behaviour, but rather it's a central pillar to animal culture, and in that I include human culture. And I find myself agreeing with the quote that Gordon puts at the beginning of his book. It's a quote from Johann Huizinga, and it goes like this. Now, in myth and ritual, the great instinctive forces of civilized life have their origin. Law and order, commerce and profit, craft and art, poetry, wisdom and science, all are rooted in the primeval soil of play. I'm James Robinson, you're listening to Multiverses. Gordon Burghardt, thank you for joining me on Multiverses.
I'm glad to be here.
I think many people might think that play is, a curious subject, but it doesn't necessarily deserve serious academic attention in animals. Why should we study play in animals?
Well, for one thing, it is a very common behavior that animals do. It's been known, of course, for that mammals and some birds play a lot, dog, puppies, and cats, and horses and animals that we're familiar with. But we now know that many other animals play, including lizards and turtles and even crocodilians and fish and amphibians, insect, octopus, and a whole variety of animals. So the question is why they do that, and how did it originate, and so on. For a long time, it was thought that play was just a property of higher intelligent animals, mainly. And so anything that wasn't a mammal or a few birds was not considered play. They always had reasons to exclude what looked like play as play, and that was part of the problem in play. But of course, play being sort of fun and not serious, supposedly, meant that scientifically it was not taken as a serious subject.
You touched on something very interesting there, that people didn't always recognize behaviors that we now understand to be play as play. I think perhaps that harks back to the fact that everyone pre-scientifically, as it were, thinks we know what play is when we see it. But to really understand play in very different species, you mentioned crocodilia, for example, we need a proper set of, a proper definition to be able to recognize it.
Right. We need to have some criteria for recognizing play that are relatively clear and allow us to define it or identify it if it occurs in animals that we don't know or think play, or in contexts in which we don't think would be playful, but may turn out to be. And one of the things is that with the idea that animals are having fun when they play. They smile, wag tails, things like that. Well, that's a good clue with mammals, for instance, but it's not going to help you with a turtle
Yeah.
or a fish, right? They don't have facial expressions. They don't have those kind of signals that indicate that they're, quotes, having fun. And so that was one of the reasons I think that people disparaged any possibility that animals such as fish could engage in playful behavior.
So we look at mammals mainly, and we say, oh, this is play because they're enjoying it. But we need something a little bit more solid than that. And that's been one of your kind of major contributions, although there's lots of things for us to talk about. But yeah, can you take us through the 5 criteria that you came up with for putting play on a kind of solid academic footing?
Right. I tried to look at all the definitions that were out there about play behavior and tried to find those that covered all kinds of play. There were some criteria for play that involved just social play, like play signals and so on. And that would obviously only involve animals that playing with each other. But animals play solitarily. They play with objects, and toys and things like that. And so if it's got a social signal as part of the definition, then it won't cover those kinds of plays. So what I tried to do was come up with the 5 criteria. And one of the things is when you look at the behavior, it's not completely functional or adaptive in the context in which you see it. Incompletely functional is what I called it. So you see the animals may look like they're fighting or wrestling and so on, but it's not serious fighting.
Right.
But it doesn't mean it doesn't have any function. It might be helping them in many ways develop their muscle skills and practice movements and things like that. But on the surface, it doesn't seem to be functional as the behavior itself, or like with a cat playing with a rubber mouse. It clearly knows it's not food, but it attacks it, releases it, attacks it again, and does things with it. And so that would be, another indication of behavior that was incompletely functional in the context in which it is expressed. Another criterion would be that it is done for its own sake, or voluntarily, or for fun. Any one of those criteria would, or those statements would fit. In other words, the animal's not coerced into doing it.
Yeah.
So that's important. So even like with kids, if they're forced to play, then it's not really play, right? From their perspective, and we have to look at the animal's perspective and or the child's. And then a lot of times behavior is incomplete or awkward or appears earlier in life than it normally is necessary for serious purposes. So like with rats, it turns out that rats are one of the most playful species, and they've been the focus of the most play research of any animal, are rats. But they primarily play when they're young.
Right.
For a period after weaning, for several weeks, they are really motivated and to play in very complex social ways. Later in life, they may still play with objects and do other things, but it sort of wanes. And so we often think about play as something that's characteristic of young animals. But not only. The first documentation I had of play in a turtle was of a turtle that was older than me.
Was this Pig Face?
Yes, that was Pig Face at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. So that's another one of the criteria. Either it's looks different than the normal behavior, or it appears earlier in ontogeny than would normally appear. And then the behavior has to be repeated. If you see a one-off example of a behavior. Um, that I would we can't say that's play. An animal comes up to an object and pushes it, and then walks away, doesn't do anything more with it. Wouldn't say that was play, but it's just sort of a curious exploration,
Hmm.
exploratory response. But if it comes back to the object, picks it up, manipulates it, and does things in a repeated fashion, uh, then we can. That's one of the criteria. So it has to be the animal may do this behavior only for a short period in its life,
Right.
but it does it many times in that short period.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, a lot of animals play throughout their whole lives. Humans, apes, and things like that. And then the last criterion is that the animal has to be a relatively healthy, stress-free, not imbued with competing needs or fears, social problems, social stress, and things like that. And that's why often we find animals that play a lot in captivity, if they're kept in good conditions in captivity, and they don't have to deal with predators and finding food and things like that. They have the more the time and the resources to engage in play.
Hmm.
And one of my first ideas was that this was sort of a way of escaping boredom.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. So I mean, I really like this set of criteria, and it, one of the reasons is the point that you made earlier, where it doesn't specify any particular characteristic of play or sort of form of play. It doesn't say, oh, it's got to be kicking a ball or moving around or interacting with others. It just gives this very broad yet quite restrictive enough set of criteria. So we have the functionally incomplete and sort of end in itself, which there's interesting links between these, of course, because if something were functionally complete, then it sort of means that oftentimes it wouldn't be an end in itself, right? You wouldn't do it for the pure pleasure of the activity, and of course then there's the link to it being either precocious or structurally different. Again, if it weren't functionally incomplete, it seems it wouldn't necessarily be precocious because you'd already be sort of doing that activity seriously. And so, yeah, there's kind of interesting, almost conceptual overlaps. One thing I'm curious about is whether you see any of those criteria somehow more fundamental than the others. For instance, could we, if we see all of the first four criteria satisfied, but animals sort of stressed, might we say, oh, despite it being under stress or ill or whatever, it's playing nonetheless?
Well, we do know that there are evidence that play may be a way of dealing with stress.
Mm-hmm.
So mild stress and boredom, of course, is a stress.
Yeah.
So if you're under stress, and even if you're a kid in a very poor circumstances and don't have a lot of resources in your family, you see kids playing. Unless they're sick or unless they're starving, so that their bones are showing, because there is this internal motivation to engage in this behavior. So, but if there is some stress in the environment, like food shortages and so on, studies have shown that with monkeys, for instance, and the same species in populations where there's plentiful food or maybe not so much food of a more harsh environment, the same species has different levels of play behavior. And animals that live in seasonal areas where there's a dry season and a wet season, and when the dry season there's not much food and so on, play goes down. And then when the fruit comes out in the wet season, fruit eating monkeys and so on, we see an increase in play. That's been shown on howler monkeys, for instance. So there's quite a bit of evidence showing that the resources available to the animal, nutritional resources, among others, but they're very important, can provide a context in which play is seen more often.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Previous guest was Simon Kirby, who studies language evolution. Perhaps his kind of central thesis is that while humans don't have any sort of special brain for language learning, the removal of certain selection pressures has meant that we're able to interact much more, imitate each other much more, and sort of pass down a communication system because we're not in such fierce competition with one another. We can sort of get closer, as it were, and collaborate more. And so it's interesting, again, how there the kind of removal of stress. I think language itself is very, very playful. And possibly language learning really does actually fit many of those, or maybe all of those criteria.
Oh yeah, the verbal play is certainly repartee and so on. Is playful. It can be social play. There's studies showing that babbling and so on, and babies when they're practicing, and at night they'll sort of say words and things. Those seem to fit the play criteria, and they've even been identified in parrots. Language learning that they babble.
Yeah. I certainly find myself babbling sometimes. I try not to do it too much on this podcast, but I think I mean it speaks to that point. And again, just the thinking of parents, it's clear that parental care creates that space, I guess, for play. So perhaps that's part of why it's much more recognizable in some species rather than others.
Right. I think parental care buffered the animals in a way from having to deal with a lot of the serious issues that for survival on their own. So a young reptile, typically that's born with no parental care, has to immediately at hatching or at being born by the mother, has to find food, protect itself from the elements, defend itself, have anti-predator, systems all ready to go if it's going to survive at all. And of course, many do not. But you have an animal that's born in less developed states. I mean, the reptiles are really precocious. They have all their functional systems going, locomotor and sensory, whereas like a human baby or a rat pup is born blind, and ears are covered and so on, and it's maybe quite a number of days before the eyes open, before the ears function normally, and so on. So that then the parents providing the food and protection and a warm, safe place, but they're in a sort of then relatively boring area, and as they're developing, they have their behaviors that are the instinctive kind of mechanisms or behavior systems that are that they're going to need to exploit for survival. They're ready to go, and so in that environment, they're going to maybe start practicing or playing, or they want to do something because it's important to keep the body moving. And that's so we talk about what is play for. We have to distinguish between the delayed benefits, the whole idea about the practicing for future, the fighting ability or foraging skills, or the immediate functions of play in providing exercise, getting the heart moving, sensory motor coordination, and those kinds of things. So we have both the immediate and delayed functions of play, and often we don't recognize the need to distinguish those.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said. It's interesting how the fragility of certain species, creates this kind of duty of parental care or the necessity of parental care, and that opens the space for play. And at least from a human perspective, that seems like a very good thing. I'd say in general, humans, we have a very positive view of play. However, I did want to point out that I think your definition is very leaves out any kind of valence there. It doesn't say play is positive or negative. It's just if you fit these criteria, it counts as play. But you're not making any kind of argument for play being beneficial, even adaptively.
Right, it could have no real function at all. And that's what I talk about: primary play, process play versus secondary versus tertiary process play, which I think maybe is sort of an evolutionary trajectory that play has taken, so that it has become, I think, quite important and maybe essential for us becoming human in a way, and our cognitive skills and emotional complexity may be really due to playfulness.
Yeah. And maybe talk us through that. So I guess primary play is sort of, it's almost like those proximate causes, like what sparks it in the first place. And it might be, like you say, boredom in an animal which has just got an excess of resources and energy, and it just, it's playing with it's testing out its instincts. So that would be sort of at the, I guess, least adaptive or useful. It's more or less just an outlet.
Right, and this was the basis of the surplus energy theory of play from the 19th century with Schiller and Spencer and some of those people, which was then attacked by other people who had the practice theory that play really was practice for serious adult behavior, and both of them ignored the immediate functions of play, what it provides for the animals emotionally and in terms of physical development. But it is true that behavior can manifest itself in many different ways. But the surplus energy idea was one of the things that was a spark in my mind.
Right.
But I thought it was more than just energy, metabolic energy. It was also the resources.
Right.
So time is a resource. So that's why parental care provides a space. And animals that can do more things with their body have a richer instinctive repertoire of behaviors. You're going to find more play in animals that can do more things with their bodies. And I started my career focusing on snake behavior. And snakes really have some limitations, right? I mean, they don't have limbs, they don't have mobile faces and things like that. And so I discovered examples of play in lizards, sort of very closely related to snakes. But there's not too many good examples that we can identify as play in snakes. There are some, but they have fewer ways of fitting those criteria.
Right. I guess maybe the onus is sort of on us to see. They could actually be quite playful, but it might just be very hard to recognize, I suppose. Like the play could be extremely subtle, or maybe even more or less invisible, like be kind of internal. I don't know.
Well, one of my ideas has been that in child studies, they talk about pretend play and pretense and sociodramatic play, and imagination.
Mm.
And I think that these may have developed out of physical play, so that we get to the point that we don't have to actually do the behaviors. We can mentally rehearse them
Yeah.
in our minds. So we can say, if I want to find the best way home, driving home, I can imagine, well, if I go this way, well, there's a traffic light there, there's maybe congestion there on the roads. And so I don't have to actually do it and then learn through trial and error, like in a maze, which is the best way home. But I can make a mental map and then, explore that. And I think play can provide the resources for animals to have the mental capacity to internalize and so have mental play.
Mm.
And so imagination, pretense come out of that behavior.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how a lot of play does seem to involve imitation. I mean, one of your criteria is repetition, and one often sees children, but also animals kind of imitating other animals, older animals, and but with variation. So it's almost like, and that's very similar to what happens when we're thinking about things, like your example of driving home. One has this kind of internalized model of the world where you're making changes, but perhaps the entry point to that is a more external behavior where you might, another example would be role reversal, where sort of older animal, one animal pretends to, takes the role of another, or play fighting where a animal handicaps its self handicaps. And all these things are sort of, I guess, variations or changes of our normal patterns of behavior, kind of explorations that maybe can later be internalized, like you say.
Right. Well, you brought up some of these additional criteria that we use for social play that aren't relevant to object play and locomotor play and so on. And that is, as you pointed out, role reversals. An older or a stronger or more skilled person engaging in a game with a child, or we see this in bears, we see this in apes too, will downgrade their ability to keep the game going, because they know if they, always win, that's not the loser is not going to want to continue. So that's called a self-handicapping idea. And role reversal is, we see this in the rat pups playing, where both males and females, they take turns being on top and the bottom and pinning each other and so on. But in a serious fighting, there's no opening for fun, right? Because you're really engaged in a serious interaction, dealing with a resource that one wants, or they both want, and they're fighting for.
Yeah, I just want to come back to your previous thought on the primary, secondary, and tertiary roles, just to make sure that was completely clear to folks. That and let me try and state this back, I might get this wrong, but so the primary elements of play might be just what sparks it in the first place, what gets it off the ground.
Right, it could be motivational conflicts, for instance. You don't know, you do this or do that, and you sort of do something else, as
Right.
a displacement, or and people may use like video games. Well, I'm supposed to do this and I'm supposed to do that, and I end up doing something other. So that's a mild stress, a conflict, and spend your time in a video game. And of course, that can become sort of destructive, individual, for the individual, or socially, just like play that may be fun and socially engaging, like can turn into serious gambling, and where people lose resources, or they can lose everything, and so play can turn into an addiction in a way.
So I guess that's the primary causes or the forms are what gets the ball rolling, but then the secondary are ones which are sort of where the play becomes adaptively sustaining, I suppose, in that it hones, or
it maintains,
sort of keeps the eye in, maintains. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for.
So it's so this is the play. This is what I call secondary process play.
Secondary,
where the play has a role in maintaining the system, and we know, for instance, that in primates, when they're born, if you put blinders on them so they can't see for the first weeks of life, their eyes actually start to deteriorate, and so when you then provide them with light, they really can't deal with it, because they needed light experience to maintain the visual system, and that can also work with the motor system, and so this is where these immediate effects of play may partake in the process, so that when the animal is moving and engaging in play, what it's doing is not so important as the fact that it's doing something, that it's engaging in complex behavior, perceptual, motor coordination, and so on.
It's kind of exercising
skills. And an old fellow like me, we're supposed to be active, right, and exercise and so on, which is much better for me if I'm playing pickleball or something that's enjoyable. That's play. But the function is that it keeps your heart going and maintains. It's not giving me skill to become a champion or whatever, but it's just maintaining my systems. And so I think a lot of play can be a way of maintaining the behavior systems of the cardiovascular system, the muscular system, the perceptual coordination systems, and so on. And then tertiary play is the play where it actually helps you move to another level of expertise. And this is where what we call creativity may come in, or it helps you get another level of social ability and dealing with people, and helps with your imagination, or creativity. Scientists and artists, I think, are known for tertiary play, at dealing with things and coming up with new hypotheses, new ideas, and you have to do that by combining different elements, and that's sort of a playful kind of activity.
coming back to this point that the definition sort of, or these criteria sort of remove our blinkers and allow us to look further afield from mammals. Do you have any particularly favorite examples of play, perhaps in unexpected species or places?
Well, the Komodo dragon is one of my favorites. We had some here at the zoo, and we studied them at the National Zoo, but also in our local zoo here in Knoxville. And they just like to put pails and boxes and stuff on their heads and walk around with them. And that was really amazing to me. And I think I have some ideas where it comes from. But orangutans and apes are known for putting things on their heads, cabbages and stuff like that. And whatever they can put, they like to put things on their head and walk around with them. But here you see the Komodo dragon doing that, and it's intentionally depriving itself of the ability to see.
Yeah.
Now
that doesn't seem useful.
So most animals wouldn't want to do that, right? Because they're prey. But the Komodo dragon, being the sort of the king of the island, doesn't have much fear that he's going to be attacked, perhaps. And so engaging in that behavior is, I've never seen it in other lizards.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I've seen some videos of a very famous Komodo dragon playing with your shoe as well. Well, I have two questions. One is, do you still have that shoe? And secondly, I was curious to know, why might Komodo dragons want to put things on their heads? I mean,
Well, no, I don't have the shoe, but I think that these animals they bring down, a Komodo dragon can bring down a water buffalo, bigger than itself. And as it sits there, it attracts many other animals, other dragons, and they come in a communal sort of feast, and they tear it apart, and they have to put their head deep into the carcass to get, the food and the bones. And that's sort of, when you're putting something in like that, you're you're blinding yourself and so on. And yet you have to do that to get the food. And so I think that this playful behavior with the pails and boxes derives from their need to sort of put their heads deep into a carcass to get food. So it comes out. I think most play behaviors originate in a behavior system that's evolved behavior system, or instinct, is sometimes call it instinctive systems.
Yeah. So it's as if animals have this kind of compulsion to do certain things for adaptive purposes, but then play is doing those same things, but as you say, it's functionally incomplete or structurally different from, the actual useful behavior. And that's sort of the start of this pyramid that then may later create some adaptive behavior. You might discover, actually doing this is useful. This helps me survive and procreate. That's really fascinating. On the subject of reptiles, I know you're a passionate advocate for reptiles and for trying to argue for a better understanding of them. You mentioned earlier how they don't have facial expressions, they don't have ears that can sort of droop, so that let us know that they're unhappy, or smiles, they don't, scream or laugh. So it's very hard for humans, I think, to empathize or understand the world of reptiles. What so, how do we go about improving that? I mean, with reptiles and in general, how do we go about better understanding and moving away from our anthropocentric viewpoint, if we should do that?
Well, I think that is very important. We need to move away from being anthropocentric and anthropomorphic in uncritical sense. And one of the ways is by observing the animals and doing experiments to see what stimulates them, what's their perceptual world, what's important to them, their Umwelt, Von Uexküll would tell us. And we all have our own Umwelt, the environment around us that is salient and has meaning to us, but it can vary between different species in the same environment. A fly, a dog, a human in the same environment, maybe find different things that are salient, but different humans in the same environment, due to their past experiences, their age, their gender, whatever, may find different things salient and respond differently to stimuli. So we assume that something that's painful to me would be painful to you, but that's not locked in as a certainty. But since we share the same species, we assume those things. But it's taste, for instance, and food preferences are a good example where people can have very great differences in saying something is good, something tastes bad, and yet you're both the same species, right? And I found early on in my work with snakes, even that they have, even the snakes from the same litter, brothers and sisters, had different food preferences right at birth. And so these are evolved types of systems that go back to way back into time.
Yeah, I want to mention again, or go over the Umwelt, or from this concept introduced by Jacob von Uexküll, difficult name. It's such a beautiful idea, and it's been around for quite a long time, and it's in some ways very simple. It's just, we have to understand that each animal has its own sensory way of perceiving the world, and I suppose, as you say, depend not only on their kind of sense equipment, but maybe their experience of the world as well. And it seems so simple, but I think it does move us away from, I guess what I want to say is that one sometimes thinks of anthropomorphism as just ascribing intentionality and emotions to animals, but it's actually much broader than that. It's like you say, it might just be ascribing to them similar tastes and preferences as us. For example, like we might be puzzled why lizards might seem particularly docile and slow, but it might be because we've got them in a room at human room temperature, right? Not at the preferred room temperature of a lizard. And just another example, I think, we see slowness as a sign of unintelligence, but of course, slowness isn't anything to do with intelligence. It's to do with how fast you process things. One can imagine, just as a thought experiment, an extremely intelligent lizard or animal that just takes a long time to come up with answers because it's just moving at a different metabolic pace, right? It's living on a different time scale, as it were.
Oh, yes, that's very important.
So yeah, I feel like it was a revelation to me just reading some of your comments on anthropomorphism, that it's much broader than just looking at intentions and emotions and ascribing them or not ascribing them to animals. Yeah, I mean, perhaps you can. I know there's been some interesting examples where, for example, with play, because we don't study necessarily the animal in their kind of natural preferred environment, we might miss things. I'm thinking particularly here of kind of amphibians. I don't know if you have some examples there.
Amphibians?
Yeah, also turtles and things.
Oh, turtles. Yeah, pigface, of course, was the first one that I really studied, first reptile I really studied, and we got a lot of videos. And it was a big, very big turtle, very old male turtle, and in a concrete aquarium. I mean, couldn't do too much, and it was starting to self-mutilate itself and scratch, and the keeper got very concerned about this. He said, well, maybe the animal's bored, and so he started putting in balls and hoops and hoses and things for the animal to engage with, and he really did so. And the level of self-abuse, you might say, went way down. So that was one of the first inklings that these animals, could get bored, just because they're sort of, the zoo, and you see them sort of sitting there doing nothing, like a museum diorama. That doesn't mean that that's what their life is really like. They can be very active and so on. And you pointed out the role of temperature, for instance, having the proper temperature and humidity and other features for many of these animals are very important for their survival. And we're doing much better with keeping amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and reptiles in captivity, since we developed some really sophisticated ways of controlling things like temperature, humidity, raising the proper types of food, keeping it in the right environment. So that's very important. But in the frogs, what I saw was wrestling. These and dark poison frogs, which are a diurnal frog, which most frogs are nocturnal and secretive, and they're very prone to be predated. But these poison frogs are very toxic, brightly colored, and signal to other animals that don't mess with us, because it's not good. And these animals, I found and others had found too, would hop around and engage in wrestling behavior and doing various things that if you saw them in the rat pups that were doing all this play fighting, you call it play. And but the herpetologists weren't calling it play; they were calling it non-agonistic fighting, something or that serious fighting, which was really play, because they know that there was no injuries or it wasn't serious, and so that was sort of but the blinders were that, well, frogs can't play, or amphibians can't play, therefore it's got to be something else.
Yeah, there's a kind of, you've commented on anthropomorphism by omission, which I kind of think of almost as anti-anthropomorphism, that one assumes that there are certain things that are kind of uniquely human or maybe mammalian like play, and so they just can't exist in other species or other kingdoms. And so one, yeah, what sort of, we can sometimes go too much in the opposite direction, away from anthropomorphism. And in your story about Pigface, you mentioned that the keeper thought, well, this animal is bored. And again, to many, that will seem a very human emotional attitude. But it seems like he was right.
Yeah.
And so actually, sometimes we ought to ascribe these kind of human, what we think of as quite human characteristics to.
Well, that was the background for my concept of critical anthropomorphism.
Yes.
And where we don't deny that we are animals too, and that we have emotions and feelings and responses to environments, and those can be clues to how another animal might also, another species might also respond to that environment. It doesn't prove anything, but it gives the insight that, hey, maybe this is also happening with this other animal. And so the herpetologist named Dale Marcellini, who was trained with one of the leading reptile ethologists, Charles Carpenter, really had the insight to say, hey, maybe it's bored.
Right.
That was so if it's bored, what do? You give an animal something to do, to just in a concrete tub, basically, and that turned out to be help the animal individually, its welfare, but also broke open the limitations on where we see play. And then there was old stories about play and fish, and again they were all dismissed, and this was before there was good video and things like this, so it's all anecdotes and stories that people could dismiss, but now we got lots of good video and examples of play in all these other animals. It's not nearly as common as in mammals,
Mhm.
and birds, but it pops up throughout the animal kingdom in many places. And so I think that it's when a certain set of criteria and the animal's biological features permit, play is one of the behaviors that emerges.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it seems that it's not. Would it be right to say that it's not evolved at a single point? It's not homologous, but it pops up, like you say, and it seems to have popped up independently in all over the place.
Yeah. In fact, that it occurs in invertebrates as well as vertebrates.
Yeah.
And they split off, how many hundreds of billions of years ago, millions of years ago, with animals that probably did not play at all, yet independently seems to have a reason.
Yeah, so we see octopuses play. I have a very speculative question here. The next person that I'll be interviewing is Sean McMahon, who's an astrobiologist. Now, obviously, there's no ethology in astrobiology yet because we've not discovered anything. There's no aliens whose behavior we can study. But let's speculate that we do, we find an alien species, and not only that, we find an intelligent one. Not, the most likely scenario is we find some bacteria or something like, something like that.
Yeah.
But let's suppose we meet an intelligent species, completely alien. Do you think it's likely that we'll see play or we would see play in that species?
Well, that's a very interesting question and a scenario. Well, what would these organisms look like? I remember going back to the War of the Worlds. I grew up with H.G. Wells, with these aliens from Mars. Uh, so we have difficulty entering the world of other animals on this planet.
Yeah.
And a completely alien life form, we'd have to find out a lot more, like what do they eat, or how do they survive, and all these things.
Yeah.
And we need to have what in ethology we would call the ethogram, a good descriptive categorization of the elements of their behavior and the context in which they occur and the sequences and so on. And that's why for a lot of animals, we do not know how they play or if they play, because you just don't know enough about them at all.
Yeah.
They've been so little studied.
Yeah. I think that's a duly cautious answer. I mean, the sort of.
But I would love to believe that play could occur across the space-time continuum.
I mean, certainly. I mean, again, the lovely thing about the criteria is, it doesn't require that species have arms or legs or whatever. No. It can still play, and I do wonder. I mean, what makes me wonder is that, I mean, if we not only suppose that the species was intelligent, but that it had some kind of civilization and technology and so forth, I kind of feel that maybe play is that kind of tertiary play, that tertiary process of play, is almost, it might be a necessary building block to get there. You might really need to mess around with things and reconfigure things in that playful, creative way, where there's no clear purpose to it. Like, the purpose is quite far off, so it's not functionally complete. You're repeating yourself, but trying variations. You're doing it for pleasure. So it feels like, to get there, play might be quite an important step on the journey.
Right. No, I think if we could find it in alien life forms, that would really cement the idea that play is an extremely important means for organisms of any kind to evolve into to be complex and intelligent and so on.
Yeah. Although this does remind me, I want to again emphasize that while in there's certain movements which really promote play very strongly, like the kindergarten movement, which I think is a wonderful thing, for example. But you give some great examples of the fact that play can be, it's not necessarily a good thing. Perhaps it could move civilization forward, but it can be regressive. You mentioned how it can turn into addictions and it can become compulsive, and also, even where it's not compulsive, there might be there's quite an old example in your book of I think it's Edward Thompson, who talks about a sparrow dropping stones on a poor toad or who's stuck in a fence post hole.
That's cruelty, and torture can be from the perpetrator's viewpoint, play, not from the victims. Same thing with teasing and bullying, and often the people who do that think, "Oh, I'm just playing. Why are you taking it so serious?" But if you're the target, you take it serious, and it's humiliating or demeaning or whatever. So the perpetrator doesn't seem to get it or is deliberately avoiding acknowledging what he's doing or she's
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah, I think it's important to that we keep this in mind, because there can be a danger of maybe over prioritizing play, and sometimes one needs to have other forms of learning, for example. I think yeah, it's interesting as well. I mean, there's when I think of play fighting in contrast to that sparrow and toad example, there's often like a kind of ritual, which like a dog's bowing, which both dogs kind of sign up to the play fight and signal to each other with this meta communication. And I find that example. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's another one of the signs of social play are these play signals that only occur in a playful context, and the play bow is one that's been very highly studied, particularly by Mark Bekoff, who's one of the early play scholars who focused on canid play, and the signal, and of course you know about the tail wagging and so on. But the play bow is interspersed within the wrestling and so on, and they'll do the play bow. And there are some animals that have vocalizations, for instance, that only occurred during play.
Right.
And I raised bear cubs for a while and were very playful, but they made no sound during play. If the play got pretty rough and they got annoyed maybe with each other, then you would start hearing a little growl or a little whimper or a little sound, and then you knew that one of the participants was getting a little annoyed or tired or wasn't that playful for them anymore. But play itself was always silent. But that's not true with other animals. So you have to know the species that you're dealing with. You can't make a statement that, well, play is quiet or play is noisy. Kids play. There's an old paper on glee and kids. It's really funny little paper on the gleeful behavior in kids when they're excited and so on in a classroom, and so they're not silent when they when they play.
What's funny about the dog sparring example is to me that almost seems something that does work across species, because when one looks at martial arts, it's always begins and ends with a bow. So the striking thing there is actually that seems to have that tradition seems to have somehow evolved separately in very, very different contexts, and but it didn't. I mean, one can see that a bow is kind of a position of deference, and one opens oneself up there because you can't quite see everything. So it kind of makes sense that in both species actually it serves this role as a marker, perhaps. But yeah, on the other hand, like you say, if you're playing with children, it can be a great sign if they're making lots of noise. But great tip if you're playing with bears, when they start making noise, you might want to slow it down or call it off.
Another thing that I've been interested in recently is play. We play with dogs and cats and other animals, and they play with us, right? But animals play with each other. And so I've been very interested in interspecific play.
Right.
And others have also, because that indicates how alien species can understand each other and engage in like play fighting, wrestling and chasing games. And so there's some beautiful examples out there of of a cat and a turtle playing tag, and a dog and a lizard playing tug of war with a toy, and there's videos on YouTube. There's loads of things showing like a kangaroo and a deer fawn standing up, wrestling with each other. A rabbit and a dog playing with a dog. I mean, things that you would not expect. Animals that are probably maybe raised together or get to learn that, out of danger to each other. And so they can start to signal and appreciate what the other one is signaling, and that this is meant to be a fun or rewarding in some way encounter. So there are many examples of birds playing with, dogs, and it's just amazing. We have a paper that came out this year on that, and I recently retired, and I'm starting to go through all my old films and things. And one thing that I did many years ago at Knoxville Zoo was raise a lion cub. All of a sudden, the zoo, which was more of a menagerie here in Knoxville at that time, now it's a very good zoo. The lions had cubs, and they didn't know what to do with them. And so Jack Hanna and I, there were two cubs that called Meg and Amy. And Jack Hanna, who later became a zoo director and well-known TV personality, took one of the cubs, and I took the other one home and raised it.
Oh, wow.
And in our yard, and I would take it out in the yard, and it got big, much bigger than any cat.
Right.
And one day, the neighbor's dog came. There were no fences in our yards. Came over, and I discovered I had this film of the dog and the lion playing with each other, wrestling and so on. And they immediately could understand the signals and the intention, that it wasn't, an adversarial type of process at all. And that's sort of, I think, pretty remarkable for us to think about how, animals that are so different can somehow appreciate this.
Yeah.
With a dog and a human, they're domesticated, and they've been with us so long, and so blah blah blah. To explain why they, will play with us, but when animals of different species play with each other, it's telling us something, I think, pretty profound about behavior and how we interact.
Yeah, absolutely. When a dog and a turtle who do not live in the same, at least naturally, not in the same kind of habitats, and probably wouldn't have anything to do with one another, are able to interact in what seems such a complex, almost ritualistic way. It is, that does seem strangely optimistic. If I think back to the extraterrestrial alien species again, one hopes that should that ever happen, I think it's unlikely in our lifetimes, but should that happen, we'd find play as a way of getting along. There's some kind of common ground there.
Yep.
I think that's a duly optimistic point to end on. I wonder if you want to share any final thoughts or message to the world, as it were.
Well, just that I think being playful and giving kids in particular opportunities for recess and for being outdoors and getting into nature. I think that's where too many children are not getting the experiences that I had and other people of our generation had growing up, because dangers out there, and there's ticks, and there's germs and enemies, and bad people, which is sort of true, and we need to deal with that. But we need to let kids get out and be kids and climb trees and explore things. And there was some really interesting work being done by a variety of researchers on children's play and the importance of play, and what the consequences may be of not allowing kids to play, in terms of providing resilience, helping them deal with things that don't go right. There's an important theory there about play as a way of dealing with misfortune or misadventures. By brisky play, balancing things and climbing and so on, and you learn how to deal with things that don't work out right. Sometimes accidents can happen that may be serious, but relatively rarely.
Yeah, it's important to learn how to fail in a relatively safe context. Yeah, I think that's a lovely message. Oh, thank you so much, Gordon. This has been it's often hard on this podcast because I talk to people who've done so many things, and you've clearly done so much, not just on play, but with reptiles and bring the Umwelt into the discourse as well. So I feel like we've just scratched the surface of all your research, but it's been lovely.
Okay, well, I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.